Why? It's one of the primary theological questions people ask. Why? Especially in the face of the suffering that we endure in our own lives and in the life of the world, we ask why? Why, Lord, has this happened to me? Why, Lord, has this happened to us? Why, Lord, do you continue to allow children to die, death to hold sway? Why? Why is there the dark night of the soul? Why is there grief and loneliness, pain and sorrow? Why, Lord? It's a question that's been asked as long as there have been humans and suffering. In the recent rise of the last decades, as neo-atheism has come to the fray, more and more people have published books asking this question and saying, how can you believe in a God when there is suffering in the world? How can you believe in God if people are dying, if people are sick, if cancer still takes the lives of so many? How can you believe in God when Northwest Iowa is flooded, when disasters come and befall us? How in the face of suffering can you believe in God? When I'm asked that question, I have to admit that inside, my answer is we're on completely different pages, you and I. For if there's anything revealed to us in the scriptures, if there's anything revealed to us about God, it is that suffering is not contrary to God. Suffering is something that we have wrestled with as humans, as I said, for as long as we've been around. And maybe we should talk a little bit about what causes suffering in the world and not always lay it at God's doorstep. In the beginning, Genesis tells us that God created the human, rose a human being up out of the dirt, breathed it with life, and then stood back and surveyed that creature and said, "It is not good for the human to be alone." Even before sin had entered the world, before the snake had spoken, before the fruit of the tree of good and evil had been eaten, there was suffering. The created human was lonely because God had created humans to be in relationship with God, in relationship to creation, but there was something missing. And so God created again. You see, to be fully human is to be in relationship and to love. That's what it means to be human. And that opportunity, that call to love, creates in it the opportunity for suffering, for when we lose a loved one, for when a relationship gets broken, for when something happens that separates us, one human from another. When we have experienced love, is to have suffering. It's the other side of the coin. It's part of the deal. It's the nature of being human. If we are able to love, we are also able to lose love. We can't lay that at the feet of God, can we? For if God said, well, I'll make a human that doesn't suffer, it would be to create a human that cannot love. And what would that be? There's also suffering in the world that doesn't come from God. It comes from our own making. The good and evil in this world inflicts suffering at every turn. Even with my own life, most of the suffering I endure as I age comes not from God, not from some punishment from above, but because I like Oreo cookies way too much, and cake and donuts, and walking by them every Sunday and avoiding them is an act of great will for me. Lincoln may have freed the slaves, Washington may have crossed the Delaware. I got by the donut table successfully this week. Everybody got their own success. How many of you have had the experience? I don't know what age it happens. I want to say it was like 30, maybe a little bit after that, when every time I went to the doctor with some ailment or pain or ache or problem with my body, the answer became singular: lose weight and get more exercise. Doesn't matter what was happening. My nose could be running, and they would say, lose weight, get more exercise. My knee hurts, lose weight, get more exercise. No matter what the problem is, the answer was the same. And it's not because doctors don't know any other answers, but the truth of the matter is we're an overweight bunch, us Americans living in the 21st century. We eat the wrong things. We sit in front of our TVs and couches, and we become bigger and bigger, and our bodies rebel. The suffering is brought on ourselves. And so things like heart disease and some cancers and liver disease and diabetes and all of those kinds of things cause great suffering in the world, but we can't lay that at God's feet, can we? We've had the opportunity to be healthy as well, and yet we choose. So in that case, for God to create a human who had no suffering would be to rob us of any choices that we get to make, to take away the freedom that we have to live as we wish to live. Addictions are addictions, and you don't have to be addicted to heroin or alcohol or anything that serious in order to do considerable harm to yourself. Byron Smith and I often stand and exchange recipes to eat more fish, and we'd rather die than eat more fish. Am I right, Byron? My brother's saying yes. Yep. How do you make salmon palatable? Well, I haven't found the answer yet. It's good that my wife loves salmon and would eat it 5 days a week. But me, I got to slather it. I got to glaze it. I got to barbecue it. I got to blacken it. I got to cover it with something in order to choke that thing down and know that it's good for me. I'd rather have a steak. Thanks very much. We see the floods come and the disasters fall upon us. Tornadoes spin up with more and more frequency. People dying of heat stroke more and more regularly. And down deep, if we're honest, we know that we can't lay that at God's feet. We've caused the problem. We've filled our cars for all of our lives with fossil fuels that have changed the climate. We have consumed our way to a point where we use up the earth way faster than it can provide for us. We've filled our landfills with things that will never be here. Aliens could show up to this rock some point 1 billion years from now, and they're going to find the styrofoam packaging from my TV that was put there in 1968. We can't lay that at God's feet. Again, God could eliminate the suffering, but how does that affect humans who have the ability to be creative and solve problems and do what we wish to do? So for my friends who ask the question, why can you believe in God if God allows suffering? I think the answer or the question is naive. There's a lot of reasons we suffer that we lay at our own feet. But there are those ways in which God still gets asked the question when there doesn't seem to be any cause, when it's just random or providential or whatever the case is. And to that question, why do people suffer when they don't seem to have done the bad things? Why do bad things happen to good people, is a valid question. Those writers who rose out of the experience of the Holocaust, like Elie Wiesel, teach us that that question is valid. How to ask God, what did we do to deserve that 6 million of us were put to death? That's what the book of Job is about. It is about this question of what do we do with the suffering that does not seem to be caused by anything else? What do we do about that? If you know the story of Job, it's a myth. It's a parable. It is not history. We should always be careful not to read every piece of Scripture as if there was an actual person named Job who had all these things befall him. The first clue to that is that the opening of the story of Job is that there was once a man named Job who had everything in life. He had all of the wealth and riches he could use. He had a wonderful and marvelous family. He was an upright and faithful person who loved God and God loved him. He had his health. He had everything that we could all want. And one day, here's the clue, Satan and God are having a conversation. Does that sound like a historical reality to you? It's not. Satan and God had a conversation, and Satan says, well, the reason he's so faithful to you and that he praises you is because he's got everything. Take some of that away and he won't praise you anymore. And so God says, no, I don't believe that. So God allowed his riches to be taken away. He lost his flocks, his herds, his tent, his land, and his vineyards, and everything else that God had given. He lost it all, and economically his world collapsed. And yet God was not rejected by Job. Job remained faithful. Satan then said, well, you haven't gotten close enough to home. What about his family and all of that? So God allowed his family to be taken captive and to be destroyed so that there was only Job left. Every loving relationship that he had in his life had been taken from him. Job still refused to curse God. Satan said, well, that's because it hasn't hit close enough to home yet. Attack his body, and that's what'll happen. So Job fell ill. Boils covered his body, sores infested him, and he wished he would die. Everything was taken from Job, and yet he would not curse God. He did ask why, though. Why, God, have you done this to me? And so his friends, and I use air quotes for that, his friends came to help him, to give him answers and to explain why it was that Job had been afflicted with such great suffering. And they gave the same answers that many of our friends or our society or our self-help books supply to us in our day and age. They came and they said, well, you must have offended God somehow. You must have done something, some sin in your life that caused these things to befall you. And Job said, no, there's nothing. I've examined myself. I've placed myself before God, and I can come up with nothing that I did in order to get God to do this to me. And they said, you're just lying to yourself. Others of his friends came and says, well, there got to be some cause. You must have done something that made this happen to you. And he said, no, that's not the case either. Time and time again, they come with answers to answer the question, why? Why is this suffering? Well, it's because of this. Why is this suffering? Well, it's because of that. Why is this suffering? Well, it's because ultimately it's your fault, Job. And it reveals these friends really are doing this for their own self-justification. Isn't that down deep why we try to explain somebody else's suffering? Something bad happens to Travis, right? And so I tell Travis, and not that anything ever has. No. And so what I do is I create an idea in my own mind. Well, the reason that happened to Travis, and I might even share this with him, is Travis, you got to live a cleaner life, man, or you must have offended God, or whatever the case is. And with every explanation, I take a step away from Travis to protecting myself. Because what I really want is an answer that says, he's suffering, but you won't, Tim, because you're better than that. And that is the farce of the whole message of Job. His friends don't know what the heck they're talking about. So Job cries out to God and says, "Why, God? Why? Explain this to me. Why have you taken away my life? Why have you taken away every possession, my family? Why have you taken my health? Why am I here? What am I doing? Why, God?" If anybody in the world ever had a reason to become an atheist and reject God, it was Job. And so God shows up and answers. You hear that answer today. It's kind of a harsh answer. God looks at Job and says, "Where were you when I separated the water from the land and created the earth? Where were you when I put the planets in their courses and hung the stars in the heavens? Where were you when I measured out where the mountains would go and created them from nothing? Where were you when, moments after the Big Bang, I began to pull together particles into atoms that then became things and people and life? Where were you? Can you explain all that, Job?" And Job is silenced before the Lord because the basic answer is, this is above your pay grade, Job. I always imagine that God is really thinking, "Job, I could really explain this to you, but your head would explode and that wouldn't get us anywhere. You don't have the capacity to understand the answer to the question, why?" Now, some people get to the end of Job and they see that and they say, "Well, this is wholly unsatisfactory." What is God's answer? Is God taking no responsibility? That's to miss a central movement of God in the book of Job. The central movement of God in the book of Job is not to stay silent, not to ignore Job's cries in the night, but he speaks to him. He comes to Job and is present. It is not why is there suffering, but who is with me in the suffering that the book of Job answers. It is the very presence of God in the midst of the darkness that gives Job comfort, so that he can say in one of the more famous verses from the whole book, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and when my flesh is thus destroyed, then I will stand upon the earth and I will see God." He knows that not because God gave him an answer, not because there's a formula or a response, but because God is present. God heard Job. God listened to Job, and God showed up in the midst of his suffering. And my friends, for us as Christians, Jesus is the embodiment of the entire book of Job. We hear it in the story today from the gospel. Jesus gets into the boat. He's been dealing with the crowds all day, and he decides to get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. Now, this is one of many trips back and forth across the lake from Jewish territory to Gentile territory. The funny thing in the Gospel of Mark is these fishermen, who are seasoned mariners, never seem to get to the place that they say they're going. We're going to go across to this city, and then they show up in another city. It's like they can't find anything. Maybe they don't ask for directions. That's what the ladies in the room would say. They get into the boat. Jesus goes to the back of the boat, curls up on a cushion, goes to sleep. He's had a rough day. He's healed, he's taught, he's fed, he's done all things Jesus and the Messiah do. So he takes a nap. About halfway across, the storm whips up, and it's such an impressive storm, shall we say, that it begins to swamp the boat. And these seasoned fishermen, who usually aren't afraid of a wave, remember George Clooney in A Perfect Storm, if you saw that? It takes a lot to make a fisherman afraid of a storm. Well, these fishermen are afraid. They're afraid they're going to perish right there in the middle of the ocean. And they look around and they see that Jesus is still asleep in the back of the boat. And so they grab him and like Job, they ask the question, why? Why are you asleep in the boat? Don't you care? Don't you have anything to say to us? What are you going to do about this situation, Jesus? Jesus wakes up, rubs the sleep from his eyes, looks around and says, "Peace, be still." Dead calm. You see, what the disciples had not figured out yet, what they could not remember, what they had not yet perceived, is that God was in the boat with them, and there was nothing to fear. The one who had pushed back the seas and brought forth the mountains, the one who had blown on the Red Sea and allowed the Israelites to escape on dry land, the ones who commanded the stars in the heavens and the sun in its course, that was the one who was sleeping in the boat with them. His presence meant they had nothing to fear. And he says to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still such little faith?" You see, you don't have faith in somebody who gives you answers. You have faith in somebody who's with you in the midst of the situation. And that is the proclamation of God in Jesus Christ. In a world where darkness and evil and violence and terror ruled, Jesus came and he died on a cross, suffering everything that humanity could throw at him. He bled and died, suffered betrayal and denial. He knows the depths of everything humans can know, and then he rose from the dead to make sure that we all know that in the midst of the darkest night of the soul, Jesus is present with us. In the midst of the boat being swamped, Jesus is present with us. In the midst of the suffering that comes from the loss of a loved one, Jesus is present with us. That Jesus' presence is the answer to the question, where is God and why? We may never figure it out, but it is God who is present with us that allows us to endure the suffering. Jesus is present in the midst of every suffering. And so when we cry out, "Why?" Jesus reveals that it's the wrong question. The real question is who? And the answer is that God is in the midst of our suffering with us, now and always. And that's the only answer we need. Amen.